Well, welcome, Rafael, to the podcast Heaven and Earth. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
First, you told me a little bit about what you're doing in Brazil right now in terms of ministry. I thought it was fascinating the way that you're resourcing pastors. Do you think you could just kind of explain what you're doing and kind of why you're doing it?
Yeah, so my main job here is with PL Publishing House, and my main task is to provide literature for pastors who don't have access to good sound doctrine. And basically, we just get funds from people all over the world to provide pastors from rural areas in the Portuguese-speaking world, both in Brazil, Portugal, Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, East Timor, parts of India. So we recognize those pastors, and then we get resources from people who adopt those pastors. And for 3 years, those pastors are under someone who are providing them with books from our publisher. And we select those titles so they can get good, balanced theological education. So the publisher that I work with is PL Publishing House, and that's kind of my main task. As I said, as I said to you before, I also wear many hats here, doing from academic publishing and all sorts of things. And I also lecture for Martin Butz's seminary, who also is in the same town that I'm living at. So that's kind of a general overview of what I'm doing here.
That's fascinating. I think it's neat to have a ministry like that where you're not only resourcing pastors, but you're giving them a sort of catechesis of a 3-year program of books and readings. And it sounded like direction as well, too, is what you were saying. I think that's a cool resource and a really neat way to practically help the church. It looks like across the world, really, in any Portuguese-speaking location. I like that, but I also want to talk a little bit about what you're doing individually in terms of your kind of theological research. You're about to publish a book on Christology, which is kind of a reworking of your dissertation. And it interests me. So it's about Christology, but kind of the species of Christology is on the incarnate nature of Jesus and how that relates to his fallenness or unfallenness. So just as a kind of introduction to that topic, can you kind of map out how what you studied fits into Christology? What's its relationship?
Yeah, so Christology is this kind of broad theme in theology, and it's situated, or the locus of Christology is situated into the kind of the field of systematic theology. As we're kind of remembering John Webster, I guess. He just passed away a few years ago, exactly on May 25th. We were recording this, I think, on May 26th. And he would say that systematic theology is about God and all things in relation to God. So with that, you have two major or mega doctrines, or distributive doctrines. I think Webster would say they're distributive, which is the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of creation. So we have God and all things in relation to God. The doctrine of Christology, in that sense, it gets its locus in a kind of a mixed relation, right? Because you have the person of Christ, which is the second person of the Trinity, who takes human flesh, right? But the human flesh is created against kind of the old Anabaptist tradition, which would say that Christ got his human flesh from heaven. Most of the Christian tradition would emphasize the fact that he has a created human nature. And so in that sense, I think to answer your question, Christology does this fit in this mixed relation of God and all things in relation to God, and then the fallen unfallen debate is also within the realm of that created human nature, right? What what constitutes this created human nature? Is it it does it have the principles of sin in it, or it does not? Or another way you can ask this is, how is it being sanctified? Um, and then you have different theories, which I think we're going to talk about it, like different theories of sanctification. Um, I don't want to get ahead of that. So I think that's kind of a basic way now I would situate the whole thing.
So just to kind of get terms not fully defined, but just sort of organized, if you were to say that Christ assumed a fallen nature, you would mean that he assumed an entire human nature that is like us in every way except for sin, and yet there was a kind of a fallen principle to it, maybe the inclusion of like something like original sin or something like that. And you can correct me, I'm just going to ask the question. The other side would be that, yes, Christ did assume our nature in every way except for sin, but not an unfallen nature. And can you just kind of help those definitions have more clarity than what I gave them?
Yeah, I think, uh, and I don't see myself as a smart guy who have all the answers to these things. I do, with much about theology, I think you're just trying to kind of wade yourself into some, especially on these kind of more metaphysical questions, right? You're just trying to get some principles and work them into kind of a more coherent version of the whole theological spectrum. But that said, I think uh, one caveat that I would say, and I think I always have to say this about my book, or my dissertation, who's becoming a book here, is that I would not, and I say this, I think in the first chapter, uh, I wouldn't say that people who are arguing for the fallen humanity of Christ or the fallen human nature of Christ are outside of the bounds of orthodoxy. I think that's a very important caveat, because um, now answering your question, they would never say that Jesus personally sinned, right? Either, at least the one surveyed in my work, right? Barth, Torrance, and so on and so forth. If you want to go, Catherine Tanner, Darren Sumner, uh, Marcus Johnson, John Clark, all these guys, none of them would say Jesus sinned. They have a very uh, you know they worship Jesus, and they can't say that he sinned. Uh, so yeah, so they would say in terms of terms, right? They say Jesus. It depends on what you're talking, right? So if you're talking about
Right.
Barth or Torrance, there are different ways to emphasize something. But the human nature that Christ assumed had was fallen. It had had sin, but not guilt, or it was fallen, but it didn't have guilt on it. So there's a neat separation on the doctrine of original sin, whereas we have some traditions, a more reformed tradition, which would emphasize kind of the need of uh, guilt to follow into fallenness, right? So there's in this version of the fallen Christ, uh, people would say, no, he did have kind of sin or sinful nature, but it doesn't follow that he had guilt, because guilt is kind of it's a personal
Hmm.
it's a personal thing. So, and then because he's the second person of the Trinity, he's perfect, he doesn't have sin, then he cannot have guilt. So
Right.
that's one separation. Yeah.
Okay, and that's helpful. So it's I think in your book you mentioned at the very beginning, this is kind of building on the principle of Gregory of Nazianzus' words in one of his letters to Cledonius, I believe. What Christ did not assume, he did not heal. So the idea is that you kind of want to say that Christ assumed a fallen nature, because that demonstrates a kind of coherence of a full salvation of our full human nature. But if on the other side, if you're saying that Christ did not assume a fallen nature, you're trying to say the same thing, but you're just making different distinctions. And I think that might
Mhm.
be at least one helpful entryway into the discussion. Now, the way that you come to I don't know if solution is the right word, but a conclusion, is that you kind of pull together three major theological themes or ideas. So that would be the inseparable operations of the triune persons.
Mm-hmm.
And then you talk about Aquinas' view of the grace of union in the incarnation union, and also habitual grace. And then lastly, the kind of post-reformed idea of original sin. So my question then is, how do you correlate these three notions into your view of Christology, and specifically into how that relates to the fallen and unfallen nature debate?
Yeah. So look, it's
Easy question, right?
it's a loaded question. It just took me 200 pages to kind of get that.
Well, you got 6
But
minutes.
yeah, there you go. uh, it's so starting with I started with inseparable operations, and I think inseparable operations and the grace of union, habitual grace distinctions are kind of pretty related. I think they could be, in a sense, two parts of the same chapter, even though I separated those into two chapters. But the first idea with inseparable operations is that the incarnation is not an isolated event. It didn't kind of happen without the Father and the Spirit, if you want to say that. But it's a Trinitarian event, right? And even though it terminates on the Son, it's a Father, Son, and Spirit event. So Adonis Vidu has this helpful illustration, which I use that in my work when I'm discussing within inseparable operations. I'm discussing divine acts, right? Or and missions, processions, invisible missions, and so on and so forth. So the basic notion is that, like, the illustration is, you have a butler who's dressing a a king or whatever. The end product, if you want to say, of being dressed is attributed to the king, but the whole idea, the whole event of being dressed is inseparable from the king and the butler, right? Um, and a lot of what's happening in the incarnation, even though analogically you always have things that you can be fine-tuned here, it's also an inseparable event. Where I'm getting with that, with relation to the fallen and unfallen human nature, is that is a principle taken also from Aquinas, which I developed then later into the grace of union, habitual grace, which is that God creates as God, and insofar as He's God, right? So God does, the way that God creates has to cohere with who He is in Himself, right? The classical Thomistic theology of fittingness, right? Whatever, it's fitting that God does something in this way because He's also in a certain way. And you have, just not only clues, but also clear revelational patterns of divine action in the world. And those divine actions also represent, and if you want to use, the Barthian idea, that reiterates, or it kind of repeats in itself how He is in who He is in Himself, repeats itself into the economy, right? I'm trying to not use too many fancy words, but then what happens is that if you say that God, created a fallen human nature for the assumption of the Son, then I think you start to get into some difficult issues. I wouldn't say they are unsolvable, because I've seen, people trying to solve those things. But I think it's hard if you have a Thomistic metaphysics, which I think most in the Orthodox tradition would have, because then you have to have things who cohere with themselves, repeat themselves in time, with also kind of in a neat way. And another way, I think, another thing that I can say about this is that the principle of the separable operation is also substantiated by the principle of visible and invisible missions, right? So the visible missions are visible. You can see them, like the Son comes into the world, the Spirit comes as a dove, the Father speaks and sends the Son, right? So the visible missions are very clear. But you also have invisible missions, which are related to works of sanctification, right? Things that you cannot easily perceive, but they also repeat and they cohere with the manner in which God is in Himself. So when you say the Father sends the Son, and the Son comes into the world, the Spirit comes into the Son, right? But the way and the manner in which the Spirit comes into the Son follows. And I think if you go into my dissertation or my book, there's a kind of I wouldn't say robust, but a brief discussion of the doctrine of, or the principle of the filioque, connected to invisible missions, right? So the Son, the Spirit doesn't come to the Son, just by sheer force of will. I would say this. But the Son sends the Spirit to Himself, because the Son repeats what happens in eternity, right? So you have the Father and the Son aspirating the Spirit in eternity, right? In eternity past, you want to say that. Yeah. And then in time, when you have the invisible missions, you have the Father sending the Son, and the Son and the Father sending the Spirit into the Son Himself, right? So then the that's where it connects to the grace of union and habitual grace, because then you have a pattern of sanctification, right? That you have the Father sending the Son. So the Son, in the sanctification of His own human nature, when the Son takes a human nature, and I'm not trying to evade any notion of Nestorianism here, but when the Son takes human nature, He takes it, and I know some people are going to listen to this, so I'm using air quotes here. He takes it first, right? Because there's a divine taxis, and He sanctifies that human nature by the grace of union, which is a union that is full of personal grace, right? And this is key. And I know I've been talking for a long time, and it's sometimes hard to follow, but it's full of personal grace, which it's a kind of sanctification, and it's a kind of grace that we, as just mere humans, don't experience, because we are not united by personal grace, if you want to say that, or the personal nature. We are united to God by grace, but not experiencing that personal, right? Like the Son experienced personal relations with Father and Spirit. And then, only then, you have the Spirit kind of being breathed out by the Son into Himself, which you get into a second kind of sanctification, which is habitual grace, right? Which is the sanctification by time, right? The Son is, the classic Luke 2:52 text, where He grew in grace. He's learning new things, learning obedience in the text in Hebrews. So you get all these other patterns of grace and sanctification. Then and if I'm talking for too long, if you have any questions, you just ask me. But I'll just end with this. To answer then to the challenge of the fallen human nature is, I think what a lot of it is doing, a lot of the proponents are doing is kind of working in reverse, right? They're putting habitual grace and the work of the Spirit in separate operations before the work of the Son, because according to some proponents of it, when the incarnation is not over, or the uniting of the human nature to the divine person is not finished until Jesus finishes the work and is completely sanctified,
Uh-huh.
right? Because he has to sanctify that human nature from within his personal constitution, right? And then the Spirit comes then, helping him or aiding him into doing that final uniting, which to everything that I've been talking about here is that you need to maintain the proper order, right? There's a certain taxes that needs to be maintained by, kind of, if you want to have a atomistic metaphysics. But that's it. I think a lot of it, and I've talked to a few people who are on the other side of the spectrum, or have a fallen human nature view. I think most of them would say, yeah, I mean, I don't have atomistic metaphysics, so this is kind of comparing apples and oranges. And it is, but it isn't, because it is metaphysics, but it's also Trinitarian theology.
Mm.
And although you were working with atomistic metaphysics of substance, and all, and Barth is more, I don't want to use, and I think some people of a more Barthian tendency are gonna accuse me of not being charitable, but with a more actualistic ontology, there you go, I used the word, are not are not going to be as interesting in my discussion. But I think Barth and Torrance are, they're trying to work with a orthodox Trinitarian framework. That's it.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So I think I'm tracking. So you're saying, look, there's a taxis in the Trinity: Father, Son, Spirit, in that order. There's a double procession from the Father and the Son, and because of this order, there's a fittingness, according to Thomistic metaphysics, a fittingness in that the Son as a person is incarnate, not the Father or the Spirit. Yet all three are involved, and in particular, there's a fittingness in this order: Father, Son, and Spirit, so that the Son is first personally united. So by personally united, you mean hypostatically, you mean the person of the Word, the Son of God, unites to human nature or assumes it. And because of that, you first have the grace of union between the person and the nature. And then subsequent to that, you have the habitual grace of the Spirit sanctifying the Son according to his human nature. And therefore, according to the sort of taxes of Father, Son, and Spirit, and according to the order that you see in the incarnation, it follows that on this view of theology, it must be the case that the Son first has the grace of personal union, and then subsequently has the habitual grace of Spirit sanctification. And that ends up being important. And the other side, you would kind of say, argues that, well, the order gets reversed because the Son is non-assumptus, doesn't fully assume, however you want to put it, but yet has the Spirit and sort of becomes fully personally united at the end, I guess, the cross, or however it's exactly said.
Yeah, the cross resurrection.
Yeah.
Ascension.
So there's a different order in terms of taxis. It ends up becoming Father, Spirit, Son instead of Father, Son, Spirit. Maybe that's too simple, but I'm just trying to kind of tease it out a little bit. The one thing that I did miss though is how does that connect to original sin in terms of the post-reform discussion?
So the discussion of original sin is a kind of a more separate discussion. So it's not so much connected to the other two. So the other two form. So if you want to talk about my book as units, the chapter on inseparable operations and and grace of union, habitual grace is one unit. And then you have a second unit, which is more a discussion on original sin. And I just had to have that. I think had to have that in there, because it's just like such a major issue within the whole discussion. If you see a lot of the discussion on it, especially on the academic world, are coming from that angle. So Oliver Crisp has published a few articles on it, and his main take is usually more on the original sin. Ian McFarland has also published stuff on guilt related to this issue. And there have been some other articles coming from that angle, and I just had to take it. Now, I'll get to that in a minute. I think, as I said in the beginning, like systematic theology is about God and all things in relation to God. So I think it's just necessary. Like if you're going to situate the doctrine, I think dogmatically, it's just important to have that Trinitarian framework guiding the whole. Like, because when you get into issues like original sin, you're getting to issues of like, where do you locate the will, and where you locate the will, because you have sin, it's going to be major. There you're going to have major discussions, right? And it's all within Trinitarian framework. Like, will is connected to persons, or is it connected to natures? Like, if you locate it in one place or another, you're going to have different ways in which you're going to discuss guilt and sin and so on and so forth. But let me see. To answer your question, the doctrine of original sin is in the post-Reformation theology is usually connected to you cannot separate sin and guilt, right? So if you have principles of sin or whatever, you're going to have guilt anyways. It's just not possible to avoid that. That's kind of this is kind of a very simple sketch of the whole chapter. It's somewhat complicated when you get into some other issues, but I think that's one way that I would say it.
So you can't separate sin from guilt, and therefore, if Christ assumes a fallen nature that perhaps has original sin, it's as if you're saying Christ also has according to his person, the guilt of sin. Which I think in the Reformed camp, we would say that at the cross, he's actually imputed sin, but doesn't himself carry as a person sin. And if you do say that, I think you might say this in your book, I can't remember, but if you do say that, you're implying that each person of the Trinity somehow shares in that guilt, because if one person has it, they all three to some degree participate in it. In some sense.
Yeah, I think I had to take a look. It's been so long. I mean, I finished revisions for it kind of a couple months ago, and I haven't taken a look into all my arguments, especially if you consider I wrote that, like, I don't know, 2 years ago. But I just have to be very careful. I think attributing fallenness, trying to separate fallenness from sin is and I in my book I have an exegetical excursus on it. Like, I have a couple of exegetical excursus on like Romans and Hebrews into like classical locus or loci of where Paul and the author of Hebrews discuss personal sin and the transmission of sin. How is sin transmitted? And the federal headship, and or against people who don't hold to federal headship. And I go into debates there in my chapter on to how Edwards and kind of go about it, and how Bavinck, I think, it has a more substantial discussion, even against Edwards, on that. That just, if you don't have federal headship and sin connected to guilt, then it's just hard to uh, just justify it, you know. I'm trying to remember. I have a discussion there on like the sins of like parents and teachers and people like that, how they affect people under them also, right? And how they are also heads of their whole, little tribes. So even if you're talking like more morally, federal headship, I think is a key concept. And if you're talking about uh, just metaphysically, it becomes even, I think, stronger. Which that's what I would argue there.
So we want to say, Christ becomes a public person, representative
Hmm.
person, and if he
Hmm.
assumes a sin and guilty nature, that at least to some degree compromises the substitutionary life and work that he lives behalf of us as a public person. Is that kind of close to what you're getting at?
Yeah, I'd say that. Hmm.
So then why, if this is the case, and this is kind of a part of Reformed thinking, at least in many places, why is Karl Barth arguing for the non-assumptus, or arguing that Christ assumed a fallen nature? Actually, why is it called a
Yeah,
non-assumptus? Because he didn't fully assume. Like, what's what's
yeah.
going on there?
It's the name non-assumptus is kind of drawn from that classical uh, letter to Cleidonius
Mm.
from Gregor Nazianzus, in which he says, right, whatever is not assumed is not healed, and the people who argue for the fallen nature just kind of made it short, like the non-assumptus. Give us it, whatever you don't.
Oh.
You notice, like I spoke some Portuguese here, but I started speaking Latin, and then the Portuguese came right after. They're just so close, how close they are. So, uh, but whatever you have, uh, so that's where it comes from. They just started using uh, that
Gotcha.
that phrase. Uh, in the case of Karl Barth, I think Barth is. I think he was an astute Bible reader. Uh, he read the Bible with all its kind of economical force, and he tried to be fair to what the Bible is saying. Um, so it's a challenging thing to read Barth charitably, and I think it's one thing that we as evangelicals have not done our job well. You reading him in his own context, in his own words. I mean, of course, I'll disagree with him several places, including this one, but uh, I think it's just interesting to read him, and I think um, he notices a pattern of solidarity, right? So in the Bible, he perceives that uh, there is this theme of the Son walking in solidarity with the whole human race, and he starts to unpack that idea of solidarity into even assuming fallen human nature, because he has to assume whatever we have. It's a solidarity move most and foremost. So uh, I remember when I was first writing this chapter, which I was writing under the supervision of Chris Holmes, who is also Canadian. Chris?
Chris.
Chris Holmes. He's now
Oh, yeah.
in
Well, I don't know him, but I know of him.
yeah, he's now in University of Otago, and I was writing this chapter under the supervision of Chris, and I remember uh, he wasn't at Southern, but I just took a kind of independent study with him, and I wrote something trying to imply, right? Hey, this is Barth is saying that there's solidarity. Therefore, if the Son assumes a fallen human nature, there is fallenness in the triune life. And he's just like, just go back and read again. and just read it charitably. And I mean, he was right. I mean, he's not implying that. He's just trying to say there is solidarity, fallenness happens, but there is all these different moves that Barth makes in Church Dogmatics 4.1 and 4.2 to try to protect the divine life from fallenness. Whether you think it's consistent or not, he has a high regard for kind of the purity uh, and the kind of sanctity of the whole triune being of God. And then, so that's kind of a more pastoral concern. So the whole solidarity issue is a pastoral concern that he has. But second concern that is a more related to his own reworkings in metaphysics, which is kind of heading, and I have the longer discussion of that into the Barth chapter, which is the heading the hypostatic union with the communicatio with the communicatio gratiarum, or the communication of graces. And the place this shows probably most prominently is in his excursus on the Garden of Gethsemane in CD 4.1, right? And then he has another discussion of that in CD 4.2. But for him, the Garden of Gethsemane, if you read it with the full economical force that it has, and read it face value, Jesus is depending fully on the grace of the Spirit and the grace of God and God's angels to sustain the divine life, the personal union he has into that human nature. So he uses, and I think where this is most telling is that he uses the word risk, right? He says that Jesus goes into this risky situation. And then, and then I just remember reading that. It's like, that's kind of interesting. You're really, instead of kind of heading the communicatio naturarum, or the communication of graces, with some form of Cyrillian communicatio idiomatum, you're heading with like a communication of graces. It kind of is first and foremost. Like there's a grace that's communicated to the natures and from the natures, which I think at least that's not what happens usually in the tradition. I think that tradition is a little bit more, just heads more with a Cyril's discussion of personal union and in that. So that's those are the two things that I think Barth is doing. Is there's a pastoral concern for solidarity, and there is a heading of the personal union with the communication of graces.
Okay, well, that's helpful to kind of hear, to kind of have a little bit of an entryway into Barth's thinking from your point of view. Transitioning from Barth, T.F. Torrance seems like he often follows Barth, or at least he's known to. How does he develop the idea of the non-assumptus?
It's an interesting discussion. I think I think Torrance does follow Barth a lot. I remember though having a conversation with a friend who is a Barth scholar, and he told me this is like, Torrance is in some ways Barthian, but just they're not the same person, and people assume they are the same person. So even within this issue, which Barth, I mean, if you look at my dissertation or my book, Barth developed the concept of a fallen human nature kind of embryonically, if you want to say that. I don't think that word exists, but
no, it does. Yeah, embryonically,
form.
I think it does.
Okay. All right.
I don't know.
I'm Brazilian.
It does now.
And I was English is my second language, so I can get away with neologisms or whatever. But Barth develops that kind of somewhat embryonically. He didn't think, as I said, like pastoral concern is probably the most important for him. So he didn't think. I think he didn't think into like a lot of the metaphysical implications of that. Torrance, on the other hand, like the whole issue of the fallen humanity of Christ, the fallen human nature, is really kind of a grundaxiom. It kind of guiding a lot of what his own work is doing. Uh, and because I think for Torrance, I was just reading just before we talked. I was reading Divine Meaning. I'm trying to work on a paper to be presented into the T.F. Torrance Fellowship on John Webster as a reader uh, of Torrance. I think my camera just came out. Let's see.
Yeah.
I'm trying to rework that. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Try to open it again. Okay.
I think you're coming back.
I think I am. There
Yep.
you go. Sorry about that. So where was I?
You were writing a paper on Torrance for a symposium or something?
Yeah, the T.F. Torrance Fellowship. I'm
Fellowship.
trying to submit some for them, and of Torrance as a Webster. So I was reading Divine Meaning just to get a grasp of Torrance's hermeneutics. And is my internet? Am I okay?
Well, your audio is working. Your video is a bit jumpy right now, so it's probably fine. I think if you just keep going. Although you did freeze up a little bit just now.
Me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Here, I'll just we can just pause it really quick.
Oh, just keep. Okay.
Okay, you're back.
Pause? Okay, you paused or what?
No, I was going to, but it looks like you're back now. So I think we can hear you okay. It's maybe the video that's a bit jumpy. Or maybe not. So we're back to recording. We had a technical glitch, but you're explaining about T.F. Torrance, his understanding of the non-Assumptus, and some of the work that you are currently doing for a fellowship.
Yeah. So I'm reading Divine Meaning and by T.F. Torrance, and for kind of a paper I'm trying to present at the T.F. Torrance Fellowship, and he's working with that notion that man, I'm sorry, I kind of completely lost train of thought. I'm gonna have to hit it again because I don't even remember where I was going with that.
Well, we can maybe segue into a different thing. So we did talk about Barth and the fallen nature, a little bit about Torrance, how he follows Barth, but it actually could be useful.
Okay, I remember where I was going. Sorry. So with Torrance, the difference between Torrance, because I didn't get to talk about it.
Yeah.
We had a segue. We had a technical glitch and kind of lost train of thought. But the whole thing with Torrance is that he's trying to avoid dualistic notions, right? Of anything. Dualism is the kind of the greatest enemy for Torrance, and he's trying to avoid that at all costs. So when he gets to the incarnation, he thinks that a lot of penal substitution talk is working with dualistic tendencies of separating work and life, and work of life of Christ, and work in person of Christ, and kind of in all sorts of different ways, right? And then declarative punishment or whatever is working with that kind of faulty notion as well. We have to avoid that. So he's trying to incorporate a lot of the talk into a more personal kind of. The way Jesus really saves us, and the way he kind of substitutes for us, is by killing sin, which is working within his human nature, which is our nature in the end days, right? It's kind of working of a kind of more comprehensive notion of human nature. When he personally didn't sin, he killed the principles of sin or sinful tendencies on his own nature, and then basically the cross is important, but the way I would see it is kind of less significant. in Torrance's work, because he's kind of trying to work with this avoidance of penal substitution, uh, and 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 this, the non-assumptus becomes really key for him because it's a necessary step into the saving work of Christ. It's not a it's not a there's no personal transaction, right? There is no transaction because that's dualism for him. You have to the you have It's only in the personal constitutions, constitution of Christ, by not sinning. In the end, that's what saves, which I think is a very interesting. I think he's tapping into something which is lacking in a lot of evangelical discussion, which is a unity of uh, uh, person and work of Christ, right? We usually, just the way we do our systematics, right? We separate like person and work. It's just didactically, I think that has a lot of value, but I think in our talk, we separated a lot. And he's trying to unify the whole thing. Some value, but I would argue is taking it a little bit too far.
So basically what he wants to do is say that Christ is renovating his human nature via his person, and through that renovation, he's healing it in such a way that it's really the life of Christ in his person that sort of becomes ours through some sort of incorporation or something like that, which makes the penal substitutionary aspect of the cross, maybe it displaces it. It's less central than it would be maybe in a typical Reformed paradigm. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think it would be totally fair, and I have a lot of respect for Torrance. I mean, I learned a lot from him, but I think that's I presented a paper once on this, and there was a Barth scholar in the room. Sorry, a Torrance scholar in the room, and I was presenting a paper basically just saying what I said to you, and plus making some other implications, especially connected to the grace of union and habitual grace, and saying that if you have this kind of paradigm that Torrance has, then in the end the cross is kind of not really that important. And the Torrance guy was, I'm not going to say his name, but he was kind of really offended that I kind of said that, because Torrance does have a discussion of that. And in the end, I think in a lot of scholarly discussion, things tend to get heated when you're kind of latching to a certain person. And I don't mean that in any pejorative way. I didn't mean to say like, oh, Torrance doesn't care for the cross. I'm just saying it's just less important. Whereas in a more, can say, reformed, I think it can go even patristic. Say the cross is, I mean, Christ. Why did Christ come? He came to die, right? I mean, the cross is the shadow of the whole ministry of Christ. It's making a big shadow into the whole life and ministry of Christ. So I think you cannot like say, oh, they're just, it's just kind of a whole unit. I think that the cross really is a point, like the Christ is walking towards the cross. That's it.
Yeah, John Bear sort of makes the argument with Athanasius' two-part book, Against the Gentiles and on the Incarnation, that really, if I remember right, a lot of it is basically leading up to the idea that he's the man who ascends the cross. Mm-hmm. And so even in the work on the Incarnation, which is rightly famous, I think he would argue, I might be misrepresenting a bit, but he would basically argue that the cross is very central to Athanasius' thinking here, which is interesting because you mentioned patristics. So I want to hit on one. Go on.
I would just say this. I mean, it's Jesus is really walking, like the book of Luke, right? Like, where's the hinge, right? He set his face towards Jerusalem. And why did he set his face towards Jerusalem? Because he knows he's going to die, right? So just pay attention, like just paying attention to kind of important key Bible hinges would just give you a lot of where he should go here.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like what you just said there, those hinges, because I think I can't remember the scholar, but the idea is that the Gospels are, in one sense, like a long passion narrative.
Mhm.
At least the latter half of the Gospels. So I want to ask you one last question. So we've kind of talked about definitions. We've talked about the other side in terms of the non-Assumptus. The last thing I want to say is, how would you positively describe the nature that Christ assumed, and in what manner did he assume it? What would be the positive way of putting it?
Well, that's a great question, and it's not a question that I do answer in my book.
Ah,
I think I don't answer that question because if you think about it, like what my work is doing, and I say this in my thesis, is I'm trying to lay out just fences on how you can talk about the humanity of Christ. Where I think the non-assumptus view is a little bit off. I'm not proposing this is the manner or this is what it is. I'm just trying to say, if you follow this basic Trinitarian axiom of, whatever God is in himself, he is in time, there's a certain repetition with analogical constraints, uh, then you can only talk it about this way. But it's the classical discussion of the creeds, right? You have like a little box, and
right.
then you can be more towards the left or more towards the right, more towards the center, but you're still within the whole way. Now, this box that I created is not a box of like whoever is outside this box is not a Christian. It's just like these are certain ways I think that the Christian tradition and the Bible are giving us for talking appropriately of Christ, but I'm not really giving a positive
So they're
way.
productive, helpful, beneficial, wise, traditional, and biblical ways in which you can talk about the incarnation, but they're not necessarily conclusions. Is that sort of
That's
what
right.
you're
Yeah.
getting at? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you might disagree with me, but I kind of, I know there's a bit of a disagreement here. I think you actually might, because you side with a scholar whose name I can't remember, but I find Chalcedon isn't really a positive affirmation of anything as such.
Mm.
Rather, it is giving you syntax to do theology. It's meant to free you up for theology rather than to tell you the answer to a particular theological conundrum. Now, I know that you, Sarah Coakley, I believe, she takes the literalist
Sarah
view.
Coakley. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
and I
Sarah
might
Coakley.
misunderstand it, but the literalist view looks like it affirms that Chalcedon makes an ontological positive statement about
Hmm.
the two natures of Christ in one person. Which I guess I wouldn't necessarily disagree. I'm not sure that's the focus of it. So how would you correlate Chalcedon to your discussion?
Yeah. Uh, I think it does both things. I think the literacy, if you look at the other discussions, it's like there's some who say Chalcedon doesn't really do anything or whatnot. I think what Sarah Coakley is saying is that it does give you, and I keep coming back to this word, but because I think it's important, it just gives you metaphysical apparatus to work with it. So
Mm-hmm.
if you look into the whole development of doctrine and within Constantinople 2 and 3, uh, they're nothing more than just kind of, this is what really Chalcedon does for you. So you say the discussion of Christ's will, uh, the location of Christ's will, siding with Maximus. It's not so much, hey, this is something new. It's more like it's what Chalcedon affirms.
Mm-hmm.
It's giving us this thing, and yeah, I think it's a key thing. I don't know if I answered what, I don't remember your
Well,
question.
no, I'm just kind of curious that your Chalcedon, this sort of positive kind of ontology or metaphysical description. I find I don't know if you know this, but Maximus might be my favorite theologian. Well, Gregory of Nazianzus,
Oh,
but
cool.
Maximus in a sense. So I like, he has a phrase where he says Christ is from two natures, ek, which is from Cyril of Alexandria. Christ is in two natures, which is the Chalcedonian definition. And then Christ is two natures, which I guess some people think it's Leontius of Byzantium, but it could also be his unique contribution to the syntax. And I guess insofar as he's drawn from Chalcedon, he actually is seeing Chalcedon as giving a sort of metaphysical description, because the in, right, you have two natures subsisting in the person. Or sorry, the person subsisting in two natures. Wait, did I get that backwards? My brain's not connecting.
The nature subsists in the person.
Okay, yeah. So he actually does sort of have a positive view there, and then he follows Cyril and adds his own. Yeah, it's good to get those ones backwards. But I find his sort of positive description satisfying, because it's not saying too much. It's not denying the mystery. It's not evacuating it, but it does give you help. I think the from, in, and is two natures. And it gives you some help from different angles. So I found this whole conversation interesting. I didn't read through your entire book or dissertation, but I was able to kind of read, I think, the argument. It seems entirely interesting to me. I think it's hard to escape Thomistic metaphysics if you're, even if you're not in the Western tradition. Thomistic metaphysics, in my view, are essentially Damascene metaphysics put in a different mode. So they are in very, and Maximus connected to that too. I don't really think there's, how should I put this? It's hard to deny Thomistic metaphysics if you're a Christian, because they're not only rooted in a sort of in a revelation very clearly, but they're rooted in reality very clearly. And I think in the Christian tradition that the Spirit has worked in very clearly. So anyways, I think it's interesting. So I like your thesis. I like your argument. I think I agree with it, although I didn't obviously read the conclusion, but the way that you described it here especially seems to me very agreeable, very helpful. And I think it is a contribution into thinking about how to talk about these issues. And I do appreciate that you're not picking up the pitchfork and burning people at the stake in this conversation. Because if you just step back and think about it, everybody is saying Christ never sinned. Christ is perfect according to his person, which has both human and divine natures. Then I think we can kind of just settle down a little bit and then talk about the specifics without attacking each other in terms of being a heretic, because we're affirming what orthodoxy confirms. It's the implications, right? So
go ahead.
I was
just going to say, I think. So I think the whole issue of Thomistic metaphysics, I think, is important. In the end of the day, you have to pick one, right? So it's one of those issues of, like, when reading the Bible, that you're not coming really to the Bible as a kind of an empty, you don't have any lens or whatnot. You do have, like, I'm being shaped by this thing, but I also have my my prejudgments or whatnot. So you kind of pick. At the end of the day, you cannot go with this forever. So you pick one metaphysics, like which metaphysics coheres more with the reading of the Bible that I'm seeing. So I would say it is a sort of a choice, but it is sort of a choice, but you have to evaluate according to Scripture. So that's pretty much it.
It's helpful. Before we finish, tell us about your book. Like, when's it coming out and what to kind of expect?
It's coming out in August, according to Lexham. I don't know how things with this pandemic are going to play out. So, that's what I know. That's what they told me. It's coming out in August. I mean, they're pretty good. I have, it's the first time I'm publishing a book, so I don't know, but the people who are working with me are kind of really fast. They get back to me usually pretty fast, and I don't have any complaints. So I'm assuming it will come back in August.
And will that be digital and paper?
Yeah, it's coming as everything: Kindle, Logos,
cool.
Paperback. I don't think it's coming as a hardback though.
Very good.
It's
I think
it's going to be pretty cheap. I think it's going to be like, if you're pre-order, it's like $19.
so that's what I love. That's one useful thing about Lexicon. If you can publish academic work and people around the world can buy it, because it's digital as well, right? For an affordable
Mhm.
price, I think that's going forward going to be super important. I think
Yeah.
I have some complaints about expensive academic work, but you know,
Don't we
that's
all?
that's a different discussion, I guess. So thanks, Rafael. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it. Blessings on your
Yeah.
work, and thanks for talking with me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.